Yura, everyone. Cameron Costello here, the Deputy Chair of the Queensland Tourism Industry Council. Just want to say Yura, hello, and welcome to our QTIC webinar. I'd like to welcome everybody to QTIC's NAIDOC webinar, NAIDOC being our weekly celebration each year for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, and celebrating that with not only Indigenous people, but also the broader community within Australia, celebrating the great achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we meet across, not only within Australia, but across the globe. So I'm on Quandamooka country, which is my traditional country at Moreton Bay off Brisbane. It's fantastic that everyone can join us today, which would be an exciting time to hear about First Nations tourism happening across the globe, in particular dealing with this global pandemic that is out there, and we, of course, our thoughts go out to all those communities across the globe that are dealing with this once-in-a-lifetime crisis. We are very happy to be able to commemorate NAIDOC Week. It's been actually deferred officially to the end of November, but given that this is NAIDOC Week, we are especially delighted that we can celebrate it and be joined by a wonderful panel that I'll introduce now. We've got Keith Henry. Keith, can you wave? Who's the chair of ITAC, the Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada, and also the CEO. We've got Dale Stevens, who's chair of Maori Tourism over there across the Pacific, across the Trans-Tasman area, and of course the wonderful, delightful Suzanne Thompson, who is on speaker phone there from Yatadak, who will explain that also there, so what her organisation does soon. So I want to thank you so much. I don't know what time it is with you, Keith, but we're just pleased that you could join us. It's a very important time for us to celebrate First Nations tourism. Both of you have been to Australia. Both of you have been involved with QTIC, Destination IQ, Indigenous Queensland, and Destination Q things in Australia. And I must say that you've made significant impacts and impressions upon the tourism sector with your insights and knowledge about how your First Nations peoples have dealt with tourism. So I will hand to you very shortly, but I just want to now invite and introduce Mr. Daniel Geschwind, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Queensland Tourism Industry Council, just to say a few words. Daniel, are you there?
Yes, thank you, Cameron, and thank you everybody for joining us here today. I apologize for being incognito, as it were. It wasn't the plan, but for some reason my camera does not work, so apologies for that. But I'm certainly there in spirit and eagerly awaiting what's going to be said here today. We meet under indeed unusual circumstances, and every year we have this NAIDOC event, and it's getting bigger and better every year, and we could never have imagined that we would meet under the circumstances that we face today. And it is a tragedy indeed, not just for First Nations people across the world, but for all people across the world, and the suffering it's inflicted on all the tourism community is dramatic and profound, and it's going to be a long road back. And I do believe that we have a role to play as tourism operators, as an industry, including the First Nations tourism part, in fact, more so than ever before, in leading the community and the world, if you like, back to out of this crisis, out of these dark times, into a better place. And I really do genuinely believe that tourism has a big role to play. And I look forward to working with all of you. And as an organisation, the Queensland Tourism Industry Council remains committed to creating a better world through tourism, importantly through First Nations work as well. And I am really happy if the circumstances brought about the fact that we have Keith Henry and Dale Stevens, good friends of our organisation, back into the fold here with us, and we can connect across the oceans. And it's a great delight to see you both, hopefully again in real life very soon. So welcome to the two of you, and to Suzanne, who is nearest to us, but like me, invisible. So hello, Suzanne, how are you? We did, of course, very successfully lobby the Queensland government last year to introduce this year as the year of Indigenous tourism, and there hasn't been much Indigenous tourism. There hasn't been much tourism, full stop, over the last 6 months, the first 6 months of this year, tragically. and we will continue at our end at QTIC and through Cameron's and Rhonda's working group for First Nations tourism. We will continue our initiatives. We will continue without any delay the work that we started last year. But the year of Indigenous tourism, well, it was, I guess, not the way we thought it'd play out. But I'm happy to bring a message from our Premier, from the Queensland Premier and the Tourism Minister to you right now. So please play the message.
Well, unfortunately, we had to cancel the year of Indigenous tourism this year due to COVID-19. However, some great news. We have decided that next year, 2021, will be the year of Indigenous tourism in Queensland. This is great news, Premier. I know it's something that the industry's been wanting to hear, and we've got so many exciting new experiences in Indigenous tourism coming online here in 2021.
So I hope you could hear what was said there. I mean, the gist of the message is 2021 will still be the year of Indigenous tourism here, and we will have much to do and much to achieve. And I look forward to working with all of you through QTIC and the team here we have with Rhonda and Cameron and the committee to make it count and make a difference as we had planned. So thank you all for participating, supporting us, and again, Dale, Keith and Suzanne, it's great to have you here. And Cameron, over to you.
Thank you, Daniel, and that's a fantastic announcement by the Queensland Premier and the Tourism Minister, who, you know, we have to pay their dues. They've been very supportive of the Indigenous tourism sector in Queensland. Tourism Minister Kate Jones, in particular, has been a strong advocate for First Nations tourism, and they committed $10 million to Indigenous tourism this year. And there's grants programs out at the moment. We're waiting to hear of the infrastructure outcomes for that. So thanks very much to the Queensland Government, and also just acknowledging the QTIC board and their support and the role. We've had Indigenous Employees Network for over 10 years. The QTIC board has, taken the opportunity to actually support the First Nations tourism moving forward. We've had an Indigenous working group that's developed a First Nations tourism plan for Queensland and is implementing that as well. So a strong foundation being prepared and developed for Indigenous tourism in Queensland. And given the background of what's been happening, it's now a great time to talk about what's the impacts of COVID been on First Nations sector across the globe. I might start off with Keith. I've been following your tweets and what's happening over in Canada in particular, and your advocacy with the federal government over there. Keith, tell us about firstly about your role, and then just some of the impacts of what was happened with you over there in Canada.
Great. Well, first of all, it's an honor to be here today, and hello from, I'm coming to you from Vancouver, British Columbia, which is on the west coast of Canada. My role is I'm president and CEO of the Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada. We have roughly, we try and do marketing and development, and we do a lot of destination work for Indigenous communities across this country. Today we have about 1,800 or so businesses that could be cultural centers, hotels, restaurants, outdoor adventure. So a wide variety of types of Indigenous owned businesses and so forth that are involved in tourism. So we're a national nonprofit organization. We have one industry representative from every province and territory on our national board, and we have a staff now we've built up over the last few years and work in partnership with our federal government and our provincial and territorial partners. So just laying the context that we've been working to develop, we've had a 5-year plan we've been implementing, and quite frankly, up till 2019, we were literally on a rocket ship to the moon. We were seeing substantial growth. Our businesses, basically business doubled in the last 10 years. In the last 5, we saw a substantial increase. Especially, we were about $2 billion in direct GDP. We had about 40,000 people working in 1,800 businesses. So a substantial employment for our businesses and our communities. And it was all, and really we were proud because it was Indigenous led, Indigenous run, and it was something to be great pride. Since February, when we started to see the impacts of COVID, we've seen the industry completely put on hold, is the easiest way to say it. So 2019, as of December, we were up to just about we estimate about $2 billion in direct GDP. 7 months, 8 months later, we're now have fallen. We at best in 2020, we'll only come back to about 550 million in sales. So to give that in direct GDP, so what that actually means, we've been tracking our sort of industry growth since the late 90s, early 2000s. We're below the last economic report that was put in the late 90s at 550 million in direct GDP. So essentially, in 6-7 months, like the tourism sector, the non-Indigenous at large, we've essentially lost 20 years of really calculated strategic growth. So we've now been continuing to do our assessment. We've actually got a solution-based strategy now. We've had to reshift all of our national plans. We've come out with new sort of, we did a lot of advocacy with our federal government. And fortunately, for the most part, we've had strong support from governments to address the COVID crisis, as we call it here in Canada. And frankly, Canada has been not hit as hard as some of the other countries, much like I think similar with what we're seeing in Australia. Having said that, there's different pockets of our country that are being hit harder than others. And because Canada is such a large and diverse country, it's not all opening the same. There's Indigenous communities that don't want to invite visitors back, even if it's domestic visitors, because they're scared about the safety risk. So we're now just dealing with the layers of what that brings to us. So I would just say, I know we got to get to other questions, but I want to say that I'm proud of what we've been able to do so far in Canada. We've been able to restructure our new vision till 2024. We've come up with some short-term solutions. We're now doing things like stimulus development grants. We're doing other sort of ways to weather the storm, is what we're calling it here. And we believe that there will be a way forward, but there's no doubt that COVID-19, we expect to lose at least 700 businesses of our 1,800 to either three things. It'll either be outright bankruptcy, or there'll just be too much insolvency, which lends itself to legal bankruptcy if they want to take it that far. And the third and most largest challenge we've got is just sentiment. A lot of our smaller mom and pop Indigenous culinary Indigenous owned experiences, especially the outdoor adventure where it's a lot of small operators, they just feel that there's really no future in tourism for years to come, and they're going to move on and do something else. So that's our big challenge right now. We're not shying away from it. It's a reality we're facing. But I tell you, we know in Canada from our experience over the last 20 plus years, we won't be able to rebuild Indigenous tourism without an Indigenous-led solution. And so, as ITAC, that's our work. It's really focused on dealing with that right now.
Thanks very much, Keith, and our thoughts go out to all the First Nations communities over there, and we just want to acknowledge the traditional owners in Australia and the countries, the elders past, present, and emerging, that the lands that we're on, but also across there in Canada and also in Aotearoa. So thanks for that. Dale, I might just allow you to talk about your role and the opening remarks from you.
Okay, aku nui ki aku rahi ngai rā te mihi ki a koutou katoa. E hui ki konei marungi te rorohiku ki ngā hau e whā tēnā tātou katoa. So hey, it's great to be back in touch with you guys again. I recall very fondly my time with you about 20 months ago. And when I watched your two ministers just speak then, I recall a conversation that I had with Kate Jones when I was there, when she said, I've got to bank on the fact that I've only got a 3-year timeline in this role. And if it's one thing I want to achieve, it's an Indigenous tourism policy and get it fully implemented. So it's good to see that they still have that sort of fire in their talk about trying to achieve that. So look, it's great to be on board and talking through the issues we have. To be able to understand what's happening in Aotearoa, New Zealand, I need to create a bit of context. So New Zealand's getting pretty good at dealing with unusual events. We had the major earthquakes in Christchurch 9 years ago. We've had 2 subsequent sets of earthquakes in Kaikoura at the top of the South Island, then in Wellington, our capital city. 12 months ago, actually 16 months ago, we had the very sad mosque attacks in Christchurch. Then in November last year, Whakaari White Island volcanic eruption took the lives of tourists enjoying one of our great scenic wonders in New Zealand. And so we seem to have been lurching from one disaster to the next and one set of issues to the next. And what it has shown us, A, is the resilience of our Indigenous peoples, and B, that we're getting pretty good at dealing with the unusual. And so what has happened on this particular occasion with the COVID situation, New Zealand first had introduction at the end of January, start of February. Second week of March, the government created a lockdown situation where the country would allow people into the country if they're self-isolated. About 3 weeks later, they decided they would only let New Zealanders back into the country. So by the second or third week of March, we had no tourism sector at all. We have now lost about 90% of our tourism sector in terms of revenue. I guess for the Maori tourism sector, though, the fortunate thing for us was that they were 2 weeks away from the end of their peak season. So they've got a great deal of their revenue that comes to them over that summer period. And so that was a bit of a godsend because it gave a little bit of a buffer. In reality, it's really just delayed a worsening situation, which I'll get to in a second. But to put into context, Tourism New Zealand looks after tourism across New Zealand, but they are a marketing company. It is their job to promote the company. New Zealand Māori Tourism is a capability and capacity organisation that educates, promotes and develops the strength of the Indigenous tourism or the Māori tourism sector. We have about 300 businesses that are members, and there are another probably 40 or 50 businesses that aren't members, either because they're too big or they're too small and they're on their pathway to becoming members of Māori tourism. So our role has always been to support the capacity and capability building for Indigenous entities. And for us, that means developing small businesses in disparate regional areas across the country that they're pretty much at the whim and fancy of central government in terms of having sufficient infrastructure to get to those regions to help those regional businesses to be viable entities. So when you get, for example, a situation where Kaikoura at the top of the South Island has an earthquake and it cuts off the main transport, it cut off all the visitors to the region, it cut off all the hotel nights, all the local sales, Indigenous products, tourism operations, everything completely stopped. And so because we have so many of our tourism entities spread across the motu or across the country in small isolated regional areas, they're even more subject to the risk of major infrastructure failure. So when the COVID situation got to the state where we were closing down entire industries and locking people down at home, Māori tourism was approached by central government who said, hey, you guys are the experts in looking after your Indigenous tourism operators. Can you look after Indigenous business as well? So, and to put that into context, I actually wear two hats. I'm the chair of Māori tourism, but I'm also the director of Māori business for our New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. So for my full-time job, we were spending our days looking after all our exporting Māori businesses who couldn't get their product out of the country. And then for Māori tourism, we were dealing with all the smaller entities, not just tourism, but the government got us to look after all the smaller Indigenous entities across the country that weren't exporting. So Māori tourism got an extra grant of a substantial amount of money so that we could help to bring all the Māori businesses through this difficult period. And the main piece of work for us has been around business advice, business recovery plans, cash flow analysis to try and understand where the businesses are at, how long they've got, what's their runway before they're in deep boggy-doos, and then what we can do to help them to recover. And so the big unknown for us is when we open the borders again and when businesses can start realistically plan to start transacting again. And as we don't know that, then we've got a certain amount of difficulty in understanding how we keep those businesses afloat for that period of time. So that's the context we're in at the moment. We are probably, and I'm not speaking for central government, but I'm taking a wild guess that central government is looking at what's happening in Australia and seeing that you've just closed down one of your regions, i.e. Victoria, and I think you'll find that we are planning to do the same here, or at least be ready to do that if we have to. So if that happens, that's further devastation for our regional brothers and sisters out in the regions because they will be even further emancipated from their business opportunities. So that's kind of the environment we're in at the moment.
Thanks, Dale. That's you know, it's extremely insightful, and thanks very much for that. And it's good to hear from that. I think that higher strategic level thinking, which allows us to then bounce down to the level of Suzanne. Thank you very much, Suzanne. I love your hat; looks fantastic. And thanks so much. I'm glad I let you come into the last speaker so that you get online with us. So that's great, and I hope you're well. And do you just want to explain your role, your business, and just briefly some of the initial comments around dealing with COVID reality? Oh, we can't. Are you on mute? Are you on mute? We're just going to check. Can we hear? Can you speak now? Can we hear? No, we can't. That's better. We got you. Go for it.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. G'day from outback central Western Queensland. Absolutely. Hence the hat, you know, sun safe. But firstly, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge all of our ancestors from which the lands we are on and we're all connected to through our bloodlines, moieties, and our songlines. Yatchada, which is I'm the managing director of. Also, we acknowledge our ancient footsteps, all of the ancient footsteps that were before us from our great innovators of our elders and our ancestors before us, but we also would like to continue their journey into the next generation. So that sort of sums up who we are and what we are as an organisation. Yatchada, as Cameron introduced, stands for Yambaka, which is in our language, on country, Aboriginal Cultural Heritage and Tourism Development Corporation. So for us, we're about capacity and capability building. You know, so one of the things that we absolutely recognise is the importance for us as Aboriginal people to be able to tell our story, to be able to get our truth telling out. You know, we all know that, you know, the journey that our first peoples of this land have endured over since colonisation. So in saying that, I think one of the things that's quite challenging for us is, and I know for myself personally, is what COVID has done is it's shifted a lot of our focus towards the domestic market. So in saying that, we know that the international market really celebrate First Australians and Indigenous people. But the domestic market, it's a very different conversation. So it's a very different, I suppose, engagement process. So as much as we have what we call the grey nomad, you know, tripping around and coming in, one of the things that we can be quite challenged with, and I find sometimes as I'm sharing my story with a lot of our older Australians, that, you know, that their perception of us and the knowledge that we perhaps have as our cultural continuum, you know, so we understand that, you know, we've been broken away from that continuation of culture. So how do you share that? So I think that's probably one of the things. And for me though, I always like to think of things in the positive light, and I believe that our old people handed us COVID because it's a restart. So, and that part of that restart gives us an opportunity on the front foot as Indigenous people, whether here in Australia or in the world, to actually share and guide that sense of what it's like to be truly isolated, what it's like to collectively be with your families to come, what it's like to actually share country and to understand country. You know, so the positive that came for us here was that because of COVID, then all of our city cousins actually escaped and came out here. So we're on a 22,500 acre cattle property. So they got to come out here and to actually be, so that month or that 6 weeks of that isolation, it grew us as a mob collectively, but that strength that I know, that I see as our next generation coming through, gave us that opportunity. When we started to think of, and I think it's how we're looking at how we're tapping into our young ones' knowledge, because it's about, for us, balancing the two worlds that we walk. So we're wanting to ensure that we're instilling those sorts of values. So we have some great young leaders coming through. When I think of our design team, or if I think of, you know, our builders, you know, if I really start to think about that as who we are, then I think it's about how we capture that. So that's sort of, so Yatchada, so we're not just about tourism either, we're about leading the way in what best practice is for caring for country. So through that, that's giving us an opportunity to share our story through a very different approach. So what we've done is we've branded, we're not doing tourism, we're doing guesting on country. So therefore, what we're finding is that that's changing the way everybody thinks. So, you know, so I think, you know, so that's, I suppose, us in a nutshell, Cam. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And you know, I've known you for a long time, and your positivity is just, I love it. It's great. Thank you. And so I want to touch on some of that. The first sort of question I want to ask each of the panelists was around, so you sort of touched on it there, which is that the theme for NAIDOC this week is always was, always will be, referring to Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander land, referring to always was and always will be First Nations land, water, sea, sky. So I just wanted to just get a bit personal with each of you and just say, what does country and land and sea and sky mean to you as a First Nations person? I will start with you, Suzanne, on that.
Yeah, sure. I think for me, what country, our land and sea means ceremony. That means my connection to who I am. What completes me is Suzanne Thompson, Inangai woman, Bidjara woman, Kabi Waka woman. So that completes me first and foremost, because that's what I present. So that to me is always was and always will be, actually gives me a strength. And now that I know that we're actually getting an extension to our year of Indigenous tourism, this is our opportunity to really celebrate the true essence of what our theme is for NAIDOC this week. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you. Dale, what does country mean to you?
Yeah, ko rangi nui rawa ko Papatuanuku are the two elements for us. So rangi nui is the sky father, and Papatuanuku is the earth mother. Kua tupua au no te whenua, ko hikoi au ki te whenua ki te mutunga te rā. So we start by coming from the ground, and we end our days by going to the ground. So that's the Māori view of the world. And we see that as the opportunity for us to protect our environment for not just for our now, but for intergenerational ongoing health and well-being. And one of the key things for that for Māori people is the handing down of stories and the passing on of stories to our rangatahi or our youth, or to our manuhiri or our visitors. So when we're in a time when we don't have international visitors, we see this as a big opportunity to bring the rest of Aotearoa New Zealand into domestic tourism and share our stories with the locals and get them further involved and loving the history as Māori see it. So the land creates us, nurtures us, feeds us, and we return to the land.
Thank you. And I know within our organisation, Quandamuka Yulabarabi Aboriginal Corporation, you know, like for us, country is everything to us, and caring for country. Bujangjara is Mother Earth, and we see it as a custodian role for to care for country for our children's children. So for those future generations, it's important for us, and yet Father Sky as well. Keith, what does country mean for you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm Métis, so I'm one of the 3 types of Indigenous people in this country, and I think for me, more than anything, it brings it back to me around, similar to what I heard my colleagues say. It's around, you know, protecting the environment, our responsibility with the work we do, even though it's in this Indigenous Act Dev area. You know, we must do things responsibly, and you know, it's the way I was brought up. It's the kind of values we've built Indigenous tourism, that the footprints we leave on the land are gentle, that the things that we're going to do are not going to exceed what the land or the resources can give us. And you know what I will say about what COVID-19 has done is really forced the tourism industry in Canada to have a serious look at how we're doing tourism. And it was mentioned by other colleagues, and we're seeing conflict in Canada today because of, like, now, you know, businesses are desperately trying to reopen, but the local nations don't want outsiders coming in, and we're actually having, you know, unfortunately in a few places, some actual physical conflict. And so these are the kind of things that the industry is hopefully, like, I think I hear a lot of people in tourism talk about tourism can be an agent of change. And I mean, a lot of non-Indigenous perspectives say that. I agree with them. Now I hope that they will take that and internalize that a step further. What does that mean with Indigenous values, like the land, like the resources, like sharing culture in an authentic way? These are the things that hopefully COVID-19 is allowing us to recalibrate the entire sector a little bit in a more constructive, positive way. Because in Canada, it's always been a race to volume, but the land and our resources can't sustain that. And I think it's time that we really take a serious look of how we're doing tourism into the future.
And that's exactly right. I wanted to lead into our next question around this, which is, back on my country in particular, we're on the doorstep of a capital city of Brisbane, and the same issues are there. We're a large population. Our community is quite, frightened about the number of tourists that potentially can come over, and they are sort of seeing what the lockdown has shown them what life is like without what some people describe as hordes of tourists coming across. So it is that time for us to consider and maybe reset in the context and the foundation and the layer that our First Nations country is one to be respected and cared for, and how we deal with that in an appropriate tourism manner. So I wanted to just quickly, if you could, within 1 or 2 minutes, just sort of sum up some of those key issues that have arisen for your First Nations communities. I know mine, it is about community safety and not, making sure health comes before profit and those sorts of things, and how we reopen in a way that is going to be safe, but also gets a balance between the economy and health as well. So Keith, did you want to outline 2 or 3 of those key issues that are coming through from First Nations about the difficulties?
Yeah, I think there's 2 issues that I'm sure each of us will have a perspective, so I'll share 2. One is jurisdiction. So who has the right to say that it's legally okay to reopen? Because we're seeing pockets where we in Canada, our nations are enforcing their Indigenous law, their Indigenous protocols. And so whereas the municipal, provincial, or territorial governments are saying, no, it's opened up, it's phase 3, it's whatever. And so there's mixed messaging, and we don't want to have that. What I'm saying is we have to find a way as partners to go behind closed doors and figure this out. So that's a really big challenge for us, because ultimately we're going to create more confusion and maybe conflict to domestic visitors who we want to come learn in the appropriate way. So jurisdiction is a big one. The second one is marketing. We're now reopening, and in Canada, we've got ITAC, and we've got a layer of other Indigenous partners like Indigenous Tourism BC, Indigenous Tourism Alberta, all these provincial and territorial industry Indigenous partners to help sort of shape and guide marketing. Yet, even though we're reopening, we have marketing in this country where they're saying, like, I won't say the name out of respect for them, but we're seeing things that are completely insane. Indigenous experience. For example, this past weekend we had they've since pulled it, but we had a local marketing campaign in BC that said surviving pandemic since 1862. Well, with all due respect to those people that think that's funny, Indigenous populations were decimated by a few pandemics in this country, and it's very racially insensitive. And I understand they meant something, I think, clever by that, but that is not. It's highly inappropriate. So we've got a long ways to go as an industry. As far as we've come in Canada, that tells us we still have a ways to go, because that kind of marketing is completely inappropriate.
And I totally agree. The marketing of First Nations tourism across the globe, and even just recognition of what happened to First Nations people, has been an issue in Australia at the highest level, forgetting that there was slavery in Australia. So I totally agree with that. Dale, is there a couple of points you'd like to make on this topic?
Yeah, look, if you speak to Europeans, they'll say that New Zealand is 2 rocks at the bottom of the world. Maori will say, of course, it's Maui's canoe and Maui's fish. And as a result of that, we are completely subject to global issues. Tourism is around 20% of our GDP. Of that, Maori tourism is around 10% of that. And pre-COVID, it was about 65% international and 35% domestic. So the major pivot for us to keep our small entities alive is to pivot them to domestic tourism. So, and I said before, our Tourism New Zealand government agency is a marketing company, and they've just launched a domestic tourism campaign, which will help. But what we've got is the delayed effect. We don't know. I don't know what has happened in your countries in terms of government to support the small business, but in New Zealand, there was a wage subsidy for employees that went for 12 weeks. It was extended for another 12 weeks. That comes to an end in September. And we know from trends we're already seeing in local business, not just in tourism, but as though the government support comes off, more and more companies are going to the wall. So for us, the real effects of what's happening through COVID won't be laid bare until Q4 or Q1 of next year, when we start to see companies who just cannot afford to keep going. I'll give you one example. It's a non-tourism company, sorry, a non-Maori company, but they own hotels in the South Island. They've done their figures, and with the government's current wage support, and they've had to close their hotels, it's costing them about $7 million a month to keep their operation going. When they lose the government support, it's going to go up to 14 million. They can't afford that. So the decision point they've got is, do they close the doors now and save 7 million a month, or do they wait and then try and keep open and pay twice as much to keep their people employed, or make the hard call and close there and then? So this is why we're getting some companies going to the wall now, but we're not getting the full effects, because other companies are hoping against all hopes that something will happen to get them through this. Now, in the tourism space, I think it's even more certain what's coming up, because we know that New Zealand will not be opening its borders until there's a vaccine, or until we've got contact tracing completely under control. And globally, that is way short of the mark at the moment. So the latest prediction I heard was taking the virus, a vaccine, putting it to one side. If there's no vaccine that comes through, we're predicting around 4 years before New Zealand's borders will open again for tourism. So that is the end of so many of our tourism entities. Our biggest Maori tourism entity, they won't mind me saying, Ngāi Tourism, they run 12 major attractions across the country. They've closed 11 of them down. They've made 405, I think it is, people redundant. And they've gone from a $17 million a year revenue company to something around 3 million, with the one entity staying open in Auckland. And that's really a bit of a blueprint for what's coming up for those other entities who are smaller and trying to hang on. But when the subsidies go, that's when the truth starts to hurt, and then we'll start to feel the full effects.
Yeah, thank you. And it's exactly the same issue in Australia at the moment with JobKeeper, which is the wage subsidy, which ends in September. So I know QTIC, through the Australian Tourism Industry Council, is advocating very heavily to the federal government to extend that JobKeeper beyond September, because it could be a massive cliff for businesses that are able to survive until then. And so it is that sort of global issue about governments supporting and getting us through. And just to point out that the tourism sector and the international education sector, which is linked to tourism in Australia, were the first hit, were the hardest hit, and will be the last to open. And I think that's probably a global phenomenon that governments need to accept and realise and help support and plan for. Suzanne, I will hand over to you. Is there a couple of key things from your perspective around the impacts of COVID that we should be looking at?
Well, I think it's just about changing the way we do business. That's the ultimate impact. And I think, and I mean, because as you're all probably getting to appreciate, I think sort of a little different in the sense of, and try to think very positively about things, that it's a restart. Perhaps what we've done as a race of people on the planet is that lack of respect and understanding of one another, of self, of each other. But how do we actually restart this for the new beginning? And this is an opportunity to start fresh. So if it's wiping the slate, which is what's happened, everything, it's all been wiped. So, I mean, perhaps theme parks, and I mean, absolutely, yes, they've had to close and all those sorts of things. But I think when it comes to cultural tourism or our tourism, I think this gives us an opportunity to become a lot more authentic. So in what we deliver, and I think it gives us an opportunity to take a big, deep breath to be able to be authentic in this space. So we're not, all of a sudden, we're not just a product, but we actually are a business, and we actually have the rights and have the ability to be able to lead in this space. So again, I'll come back to that positive, that COVID, this gives us an opportunity as First Nations peoples, wherever, to lead the way, because we actually have survived and have the ability to be able to do that. So yes, There are all those other things, but for us out here, that's how we're seeing it.
Thank you, Susan. And definitely, I agree that we must look at what the opportunities that are presented and look at those on board. In Australia, we were talking about we needed to pivot. So I know our business has pivoted to the situation, and we've looked at things around, you know, whilst we've been shut down, enhancing our product, looking at innovation and technology on how we can adapt to the new situation. So one of the questions for me, which you've talked about, authenticity, is as we do that, how do we, the importance of maintaining our cultural integrity while coming out of COVID-19, is there one or two key things that you're focused on, or how you would do that? And I'll go around to the rest of the panelists on that. So Suzanne.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, it's given us an opportunity whilst we don't have our market attending. It's given us an opportunity to really focus on what is our true essence of cultural integrity, and that's about country. So we're doing carbon farming, we're doing seed collection, so we're doing plant identification. You know, we're looking at ways of, you know, what's our seasonal stuff? What is our story when we come out of this that we're able to lead? So I think for us, how to sustain our cultural integrity is getting our order back in place and really understanding who we are as First Nations people, and why we stand proud to say we're First Nations people is because of that knowledge. And that, so yeah, so that's, I think, for our cultural integrity, absolutely. No more will we be seeing it, you know, it's absolutely, we've got buskers, but in the past, and I know for Aboriginal tourism here in Australia, it was the boomerang throwing, it was the didgeridoo playing, and it was a dance, and that's what it was seen. No, we have so much more to offer, but now what we have to offer is how to survive through all of these sorts of things as well.
Thank you. And
thanks, Cam.
I know, yeah, you're right. Dale, did you want to touch on that about how businesses are? Is there threats to cultural integrity with reopening, and how do we maintain that authenticity?
We've done a bit of work at board level at Maori Tourism around imagining the future post-COVID. And one of the things that has always been frustrating for us as an organisation has been that Tourism New Zealand and other government agencies have only seen tourism with Maori from the perspective of taking the right photos and having the right imagery in place to attract people to the country. And we've been saying for years and years, we need to get away from the 3 H's, being the haka, the hongi, the pressing of noses, and the hangi, the food coming out of the ground. And we wanted to get New Zealand tourism and the government to a place where they understand the value of the culture intertwined into the tourism experience for the visitors. So we see a real opportunity coming out of post-COVID to get Tourism New Zealand past simply putting the right photos in place to making sure they imbue their programs with the right tikanga or cultural protocols, that they're using the right people, that they are understanding the value of the stories of the Indigenous people as a means of strengthening the offering and the manaakitanga, or the care for our visitors when they come to the country. Second one is that we see a real opportunity for the country to understand the value and strength of our regions and the different elements of experiential tourism and cultural tourism and storytelling that come from the different regions. It's not just put them in front of a haka concert in Rotorua and you've had your cultural fix. There's actually different variations and flavours no matter where you go in the country. Another one that's really important for us post-COVID is understanding and being able to use technology in a much more mana-enhancing way for our people that creates more alternatives to the tourism experience. So that's an interesting take for us to be able to understand and use technology to strengthen our cultural understanding and offering. Another one is around what we call rangatiratanga, or leadership. We see this as a great opportunity to get the right Maori leaders into leadership in not so traditionally Maori areas in tourism. So we would be doing that through helping them to understand what Maori see as the best way to enhance the experience for the manuhiri or the visitors, and that tourism entities would benefit greatly from having those insights sitting at their board table. And I guess the last two, data. This is a real opportunity for us to realign all our processes to get the right data. So data is king, and this gives us the opportunity to wipe the slate clean and put some decent data systems in place. And the final element for us is around how we get those international relationships stronger as a result of the adversity we've all faced. So there's a few things in play. We haven't nutted out the planning element of it, but that's the strategic view we're taking.
Thank you. Keith.
Well, I think my colleagues, I would agree with, obviously a lot of the points they made, but I just want to stress that for us in Canada, the biggest challenge authenticity is very important to us. We need to own and we need to guide what is really being marketed or promoted as an authentic Indigenous experience. We've created a national guideline. But what's missing in Canada, just a couple points I'll raise, is that similar to what Dale just mentioned, we're trying to work with, whether it's Destination Canada or all the layers of provincial, territorial, municipal marketing organizations. Do they have local Indigenous operators involved? How are we getting them to understand what authentic really means? I mean, so there's a whole education that needs to continue in that regard. But the second thing is, unless we find a way to make Indigenous tourism feasible, the fact is, in Canada, that's going to be tough to even promote authentic Indigenous experiences. This is a time of recalibration, but some of the hardest hit businesses we have are our festivals and events, our Indigenous artists. If they don't find ways to survive through this pandemic in Canada, and it's a serious issue. So Dale mentioned a bit ago, and I just want to touch on things. In Canada, didn't really talk about the program, but ITAC has now launched things like we got a stimulus grant program where we provide $25,000 per qualified business to help them. It's a small financial tool for them. Our federal government has invested in $305 million into business loan structures, which sounds like a lot, but it's about $40,000 per business. So there's been a lot of Band-Aid things. There's things like the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy. There's the Business Credit Availability Programs. There's a bunch of federal programs. The problem is a lot of these things still are missing the mark because our government's meant well. I mean, our federal tourism minister, Joe Lee, and our prime minister have been, they're very strong advocates of Indigenous SecDev. But like what we face in Canada, even on the emergency wage subsidy to help even artisans or businesses try and survive, is a lot of our businesses, if they're on reserve, still don't qualify under the legislation. So wage subsidy can be there, but the fact is we've got hundreds of businesses that don't even qualify as a legal entity. So these are the kind of the myriad of issues that we have. Philosophically, I agree with a lot of the commentary, but we also are an industry, and we have to recognize if we don't make it feasible, it's going to be tough to promote down the road. And in our communities in Canada, there's a lot of big challenges socially around losing all 40,000 jobs and all these sorts of things. So it's a big challenge for us, and we got to stay positive. But we also, in my opinion, for us in Canada, we've been very pragmatic about how do we rebuild this in a way that can bring back those real opportunities and have the industry rally around us.
Thanks, Keith. I mean, there's a couple of points in there, and I know we've got about 10 minutes, so I've got one more question that I wanted to ask you, but it relates exactly to what you're saying. First and foremost, I'd say that I've noticed in Australia, like festivals, events, we run our own festival as well, definitely issues for us. The Cairns Indigenous Art Fair has gone to a virtual platform, so they're trying, they're out there trying new technologies to look at online sales, etc. So they're moving into that space. But I would also touch, again, a bit like the JobKeeper situation is our arts workers aren't eligible for a lot of the JobKeeper as well, so which affects the Indigenous arts industry, which is part of the tourism sector. So they're key issues, and for me, the risk is that our businesses fall over, and there is almost a negligible First Nations tourism sector because it hasn't had the appropriate support. In Queensland, we've developed the First Nations Queensland First Nations Tourism Plan through QTIC that we believe that moving forward there needs to be. We've got an election year this year, so we're believing that whoever gets in should be funding that First Nations tourism plan for 4 years. So it's as part of a recovery. It's got to be a longer term process and funding of support across infrastructure, marketing, product development, education and training. So my final question for my wonderful panel, who I've had such a great day with, thank you, is around what we've identified this, what needs to happen, what do governments need to do, what does industry need to do to support First Nations tourism going forward, and that happening, what could you see as the potential, or what do you see in 5 years' time for First Nations tourism in your area? I'll start with you, Keith, and I'll work around to Suzanne.
Well, we put together a complete 4-year restructuring plan. So we've got a $50 million outlined plan for marketing development. It's based on 3 phases, what we call, obviously resilience, recovery phase, all these sorts of things that we've sort of laid out. So the question will be, it's easy for governments and politicians to say they support Indigenous tourism, but the question will be, how are we investing to make sure that the apparatus doesn't completely collapse? Like, we know in Canada with our plan that we can't save all 1,800 businesses. The market's just not there. And, just like in other countries we've heard on this call, about 45% of our business came from international markets. We had huge growing interest, but they were spending about 65% of the money on our total revenues. So huge loss to the bottom line of so many of our businesses. So we're shifting now to domestic. So the question will be, we believe we can get back to 2019 levels by about 2023, 2024, if a phased-in approach is brought forward. We've presented to the government. We have a clear plan of where we want to go, but it's going to take political will. And right now, my big fear is that if my push to anyone on the call is, what are your governments really doing to invest to protect and save Indigenous tourism? Because we need everyone at the table now. I mean, for us in Canada, it's really critical, and words aren't enough. We need tangible investments, real plans, and we can't take this lightly, because we only know what we see in front of us. But if we hit another second or even possibly third wave, the devastation by 2021 is going to be a lot worse than we see today.
Thanks, Keith. Dale, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, probably 2 or 3 things. Firstly, to put this all into a decent timeline, Maori tourism as an entity has been on this journey for about 14, 15 years. We went from a situation where it was a small group that was constituted to look at Maori tourism and got given $100,000 to work out a plan. Over the years, that has grown to the extent where we had a full head office. We've got staff out in the regions. In the last 3 years, our budget has quadrupled as the government has seen the value we bring to the sector. Now, we are fortunate in New Zealand. Some will say we're unfortunate, but I say fortunate that we have a treaty between the Indigenous people and the government set in 1840. Although for many years it wasn't properly respected and worked with, we are now in a situation where since the 1990s we have Maori tribes receiving compensation from the government, receiving their apology, and now being what we call post-settlement, where they've got money and they're investing. Along with that, the government has gone through a bit of a come to Jesus moment, frankly, where they've realised, well, actually, they are our Indigenous people. We have to work with them and support them. So since the 90s also, successive governments have been better and better at understanding and trying to work with Maori and giving Maori more of a say in their own future. So this is where Maori tourism has become an important part of that, because tourism is a natural, storytelling is a natural thing, protecting the environment is a natural thing for our Indigenous people. So it fits very well with where New Zealand is going anyway. The second thing, I guess, that's really important is that we've got a general election coming up in 82 days, I think it is. And that will be an important election. They all are, but more so at this stage because we have no indication as to when we can expect the next stage of whatever our recovery is from the COVID situation. So us, along with many, many other agencies across the country, are going, okay, how long is that piece of string? Where are we at on that piece of string? And what do we have to do under any of 4 or 5 scenarios going forward? So at the moment, we're busy scenario planning, but don't really know which one we're going to enact because we don't know what's happening with the government. And the third one is that we are very confident that a post-COVID environment will see Indigenous people in New Zealand get an even bigger opportunity to be a fully integrated part of not just tourism, but of the commercial sector, the cultural sector, the environmental sector, the education sector, the health sector, because that's the evolution this country is going on. So it's our job to show tourism and the opportunities there as an exemplar of what we can hope for the rest of the sectors as it affects our Indigenous people. So the next 6 to 9 months is really crucial for Maori full stop, let alone the tourism sector, because that'll give us a few ideas as to where we can possibly head with this.
Thanks, Dale, and always looking forward to the positive projections of Suzanne. What do you think are important and support, and how we're going to look in 5 years?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with both Keith and Dale, you know, and absolutely, you know, as First Nations people, as First Peoples of our country and stuff. But I think for me, if I was to have a crystal ball and think about into the future in 5 years' time, I think for here in Queensland in particular, we would have a fully supported and funded peak Indigenous body because, you know, I think for us, you know, and also I think we will have a good leadership role in the development of those policy platforms to ensure our future. I think also with that, I think we also will look at and be able to start to see a lot more Indigenous faces when it comes to the marketing of, you know, Australian and Queensland regional tourism, because we actually are leading in such a way. So that's that crystal ball. And I think also we will be afforded with the opportunities to be able to, like Kondamuka and even like us and our desires, to actually establish a place so people can truly come and participate and engage in our cultural tourism through our great centres that we are proposing. We also have a place that we individually, as each of the mobs across the country, have to store a lot of those cultural assets that have been sitting there, so that we actually can choose in the right way what we show, what we're showcasing and sharing. I think also in that 5 years' time, if I think about the products that we're able to develop in that participatory sense, and I know one of the things we're thinking about here is, you know, that we have to continually evolve about how we as First Nations people survived on this planet. So to be given that opportunity, and we're thinking about, you know, school holiday time for families to come out perhaps is about coming because we're going to be relearning ourselves how to create a native well and that ancient traditional methodology that we did. So I think it's sort of in that 5 years' time, I think we are filled with, as First Nations people, with our culture and that practice of our culture, but we confidently can lead in such a way that is about surviving, is about connection and family. So I think that's for me what I see, you know, and I think we've also got definitely that serious investment. You know, we are taken serious. We're not just an election cycle promise, but it's something that we're serious about. And I'm sure you're all aware of, you know, for us as First Nations people here in Australia and First Peoples, is that, you know, where we sit, we've been fighting for, especially our Uluru Statement, and how that actually starts to address a whole lot of things for us here in Australia. So that's my sort of crystal ball view into the future, Cam, for us as First Nations
wonderful
people.
I love it, and I agree. In 5 years' time, and it's Dale said about there was a $100,000 grant. I know Suzanne and I are on an Indigenous working group to look at looking at the model for a peak body. So in 5 years' time, I'd like to see a peak body for Queensland for Indigenous First Nations tourism, which would happen. We've got about a minute left, so I just wanted to thank you sincerely for your participation today. The insights that you've provided have been just amazing. They've been real, they've been authentic, and you know, for us moving forward, I know Keith and Dale, your representations out in our country have triggered movements in a way through not only industry but government, in how, and for First Nations people, about how we progress forward. And having the lovely Suzanne, her advice, knowledge and experience is there guiding us along the way. So I just want to personally thank you all so much for being on QTIC's webinar, NAIDOC webinar today. And I would love to get you back again at some time in the future so we can let everybody know how we're all progressing. So thank you so much.
And thank you to you and your organisers and I see all these people attending. We can't speak to them. We know they're there, and for all our friends out there, go well, and I hope you get through this okay.
And thanks, Cameron, from Canada.
Absolutely.
It's a real honor to be here with everyone, and I love seeing everyone again, and miss being in your country. To be honest with you, Quandamuka was beautiful. So yeah, I gotta find a reason to get back there one day. But thank you so much for having me here today.
Thank you. Thanks, Suzanne.
Yeah, absolutely.
We say UA.
And also from the Outback. Yeah, thank you very much too. You know, absolutely. And I can't wait to have you all out here in Outback Central Queensland to share with you
New idea.
Our secret sacred business. Well, thank
Thank
you.
you. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.